Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council's podcast on the most pressing issues impacting the transatlantic relationship today. My name is James Badgick. I'm an associate director here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and we're here to unpack some of the ideas from our recent report, Transatlantic Horizons, a collaborative US-EU policy agenda for 2025 and beyond. This report aims to set a productive vision for transatlantic relations for years to come, and it offers a forward-looking policy recommendations for the next U.S. administration and European Commission specifically. And to dive deeper into his contributions for the report, my guest today is Ken Propp, a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and someone who also teaches EU law at Georgetown Law School. So Ken, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, James.
Ken authored a section on navigating between data, war, and peace, which looks at the future of transatlantic data flows. And this has quietly become a critical issue in the US-EU political, economic, and even the security relationship, and an issue that we've seen some serious developments over in the last few years, both from a legal sense and also amid some geopolitical shifts as well. So it's great to have the leader on all things US-EU data flows here to talk about his piece. Ken, you divide your section up into a few key developments in the data transfer space, mainly commercial data transfers mandated by law enforcement, and then the national security implications and limitations on data flows. So I want to start broad at the 10,000 foot level or so and just ask if you could first explain what makes transatlantic data flows so critical to the US-EU relationship. And then second, to people like me whose data is probably transmitted across the ocean daily, seemingly without problems and with ease, what makes the future of these data flows so precarious?
So it's important because the scale of the transatlantic economy is enormous. It's estimated at $8.7 trillion. Those are trade and investment relations. And what it amounts to is that the US and the EU are each other's most important markets. And one symbol of this in the data area is that there's more than twice as much data flowing through subsea cables between the United States and Europe in both directions as there is between any two other regions in the world, between the US and Asia, within Asia. The transatlantic relationship is the most important in terms of data movement. What does it contain? Well, it's everything that's hosted and moved by cloud service providers, which is to say a great deal of commerce these days, consumer internet commerce, transfers of data among multinational companies, a very wide scale of commercial activity. Why is it precarious? Well, Europe insists that data that leaves its territory carry with it privacy protections, a reasonable enough proposition. Twice in the past decade, the EU's highest court, the Court of Justice, has found US privacy protections to be insufficient and has invalidated the institutional basis for data transfers from Europe to the United States. This has led to periodic crises and negotiations, and now we have a third agreement in place, the so-called EUUS Data Privacy Framework, since last year. But it is precarious because it too is subject to review and possible invalidation in the Court of Justice.
So on that point, Ken, for the EU-US Data Privacy Framework and how you mentioned it's really the third agreement in a row with potentially that may meet the same fate as its predecessors of being struck down. What happens if it does eventually get struck down, and what realistically could take its place among a new U.S. administration, a new European Commission that it would fall to renegotiate some version of a new agreement?
Well, an invalidation of the agreement doesn't mean that data flows necessarily stop overnight. This is the past experience. There is an alternative mechanism. Companies can put the privacy protections into contractual provisions, contract by contract. It's much more cumbersome. That is the alternative mechanism, but with good reason, governments have sought to create something streamlined that makes the process a lot easier. If the third agreement goes down, it's entirely possible that the US and the European Commission dutifully go back to the negotiating table and try again for a fourth time to put in place privacy protections that meet the requirements of the Court of Justice. Whether that's feasible depends very much on what the court says. Are these changes that require the U.S. to change its law? Are they changes that we can meet consistent with our constitutional system? These are open questions. So it's hard to know at this point whether a further agreement could be reached. It's also conceivable that the U.S. could decide that it's had enough of trying to meet ever increasing demands from the Court of Justice for data protection standards. And indeed, some commentators close to President Trump have suggested that if that happens, it might be time for the U.S. to play hardball. And they have suggested, for example, the possibility of withholding intelligence cooperation with European allies. So I would add, though, that the first Trump administration actually did go back to the negotiating table for the current agreement. So it's difficult to know which direction they would go. But the possibility remains that this might not be resolved in a consensual fashion the next time around.
I'd love to pick up on your point about the intelligence and law enforcement aspects as well, since you do discuss that in your piece, and you specifically talk about the U.S. Cloud Act, which, for background, empowers U.S. law enforcement to demand U.S. cloud service providers to turn over data hosted on foreign servers. This is obviously quite a contentious issue, and one contentious with the European Union specifically. So I wanted to ask how you see that issue in the national law enforcement aspects of data transfers playing into Europe's larger digital sovereignty push, an issue that you yourself have been following quite closely. And should we understand the efforts by the outgoing commission to build its digital sovereignty in resistance to some of these developments? And can we expect that for this upcoming commission as well?
You know, for the past decade, there has been one principal symbol of the extent to which the U.S. reaches into Europe's digital affairs. And that has been Edward Snowden's revelations about signals intelligence collection from U.S. companies that send information through the subsea cables that I mentioned. That was absolutely a principal motivator for the digital sovereignty rhetoric and to some extent the digital sovereignty actions that we saw out of the last commission. Over the last several years, though, a quite powerful second symbol of U.S. extraterritorial reach into European data has emerged, and that is the Cloud Act, as you described it, since it enables a prosecutor in the Justice Department, for example, to demand that a U.S. cloud provider produce information located in its Irish server if that information is controlled by the company and is needed for a U.S. criminal prosecution. And this has become a source of some contention in Europe. Never mind that some European governments give their prosecutors the same power. The influence of the United States, nevertheless, in this area has been greatly resented. Now, fortunately, the very same Cloud Act also did create a template for the negotiation of international agreements between the U.S. and foreign countries for the consensual production of what's called electronic evidence, e-evidence. A couple of these agreements have already been put in place with the UK and Australia. The US has been pursuing them with the Five Eyes countries. but also is in the midst of a big negotiation with the European Union on this subject. That negotiation has been going on for several years. It's proven to be complicated and slow. It would be quite significant if that negotiation could be brought to a conclusion, or at least to a political consensus before the end of this U.S. administration. I say that because I think it would lower the temperature on digital sovereignty in the transatlantic space quite considerably, and if what happened in the Schrems cases and what's potentially threatened on commercial data transfers amounts from time to time to a sort of data war, then I think an international agreement on electronic evidence would bring a measure of peace to this space.
So finally, Ken, I want to talk about your last point, which is how you note the shifting sands in the national security implications of data transfers, specifically in the United States. You noted that the United States started to reverse course. You call it, quote unquote, a course correction on just about over 4 decades of practically unrestricted international commercial data flows from the United States to countries like China and Russia for largely geopolitical reasons. Where does the EU come into all of this, as you noted, as such a major partner with the United States when it comes to data transfers? And does the EU stand to get caught in the middle here? What's the future of this?
Well, first, to explain a little bit what the problem here is. In the space of just a few months last year, President Biden issued an executive order, and Congress followed with a statute restricting certain data exports to China, Russia, and several other what are called foreign adversary countries. Why? There had been research findings that these countries' intelligence and military services were buying commercially from U.S. data brokers large sets of data enabling the tracking and potentially the extortion of U.S. government officials. Now, it has always been possible to limit data flows for what are called essential security reasons under international trade law. But nonetheless, the U.S., as you mentioned, has kept to a policy of very substantial openness over the years. And so this is a significant shift. How does this affect Europe? Well, the EU is not the target of these restrictions. It's not considered a foreign adversary regime, needless to say. And indeed, just recently, some data protection authorities in Europe have started to focus on the same problem of bulk data sales by data brokers in Europe. I recently heard the new German data protection authority suggest that it might well take legislation in Europe to accomplish this. So there is a degree of common thinking here, but at the same time, there are some risks. First, European companies affiliated with U.S. companies could run afoul of these new rules, either through the U.S. statute or the executive order. That remains to be seen, but it's a real possibility. And second, there is something of a philosophical difference here still between the U.S. and Europe on data flows to authoritarian countries. Europe's data protection authorities, who have been so active in interrupting data flows to the United States from time to time, have not taken similar actions with respect to data flows to Russia or China. And there are beginning to be voices in Europe questioning why that's so. I was at a major data protection conference last week in Vienna, and several European commentators brought this point up. The security environment obviously has changed in Europe, primarily as a result of the Ukraine war, and they're starting to look at authoritarian regimes in a different way. So I would suggest that in the current geopolitical circumstances, we could well see more focus on of data transfers to autocratic regimes on both sides of the ocean.
And thank you. That's all the time we have but thank you so much for joining me today for this fantastic discussion, and of course for authoring a great piece as part of our report for Transatlantic Horizons. To our audience, make sure you give the report Transatlantic Horizons a read, and in particular Ken's section, and stay tuned for more discussions with our authors, and do give the report a read online at the Atlantic Council's website. And until next time, goodbye.